Good morning, everyone. So, so today we are going to start the class of English literature. In Romantic period, 1825 to 1910. So here we can say that where classical had been reason and ordered and rules, and romantic was emotion and adventure and imagination, opera, and we can say that where classical had been reason and order and rules, romantic was emotion, adventure and imagination, opera, and we can say that return to show off skills and implemented resonance and modulation and sounds and harsh to the ear, and changing from uh, one key to another, and use interest in songs written is part of a cycle, a complete story told with several related songs, and so we can say that romanticism was an artistic and literary. So we can say that romanticism was an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe and towards the end of the 18th century, and in most areas was at its peak in the appointment. So appointment, and we can say that at the end of the 18th century, and in most time, to use interest in songs written as part of a cycle, and a complete story told with several related songs, and we can say that in 18th century and in most areas was its peak in the approximate period from 1800 to 1850. So in this age we can say that romantic era, what was happening in the world during this period, and we can say that 1825 to 1861, the American Civil War and the Charles Darwin, and and their publishes and the origin of these passages. So we can say this age is also known as romantic era, was an artistic, literary, musical and intellectual movement that originated in Europe and towards the end of the 18th century, and in most areas was at its peak in the approximate period from 1800 to 1850. Romanticism was, characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, as well as glorification of all the past and nature, and preferring the medieval rather and than the classical. It was partly, a reaction to the industrial revolution and the political norms of the age of enlightenment, and the scientific and rationalization of nature, all components of modernity. It was embodied most strongly in the visual arts, music, and literature, but had a major impact on historiography and education, jazz, social science, and the natural sciences, it had a significant and complex effect on politics, with romantic thinkers influencing and so conservative and the nationalism. So the movement emphasized intense emotion as an authentic source of aesthetic experience, and placing new emphasizes on such emotions as fear, horror, and terror. So we have seen a lot of changes in that era. So social and political influence also we can see in this era. So as an authentic source of aesthetic experience, and placing you and emphasize on such emotions as fear, horror, and terror, and mm, especially that experienced in confronting the new aesthetic categories of the sublime and beauty of nature. It elevated folk art and ancient custom to something novel, but also spontaneity as a desirable characteristic in the musical, like contrast to the rationalism and classicism of the Enlightenment. Romanticism revived and and elements of art and narrative perceived as authentically medieval in an attempt to escape population growth, early urban and sprawl and industrialism. Although the movement was rooted in the German storm and and drang and the movement which preferred intuition and emotion to the and rationalism of the Enlightenment. The events and ideologies of the French Revolution were also proximate and factored, since many of the early romantic and were cultural revolutionaries and sympathetic to the revolution. Romanticism assigned a high value to the achievements of heroic individualists and artists whose examples it mentioned, who would raise the quality of society. It also prompted the individual imagination as a critical authority, allowed of freedom from classical notions of from in art. There was a strong uh, recourse to historical and natural inevitability, and in the representation of its ideas in the second half of the 19th century, and was offered as a polar opposite to romanticism. The decline of romanticism during this time was associated with multiple processes, including social and political changes. We can see that here. So, lot of changes we have seen here in literature. Romanticism found and recurrent themes in the evocation of criticism of the past, the cult of sensibility with its emphasis on woman, on children, the isolation of the artist or narrator, and respect for nature. Furthermore, and several romantic authors such as Edgar and base their writings on the supernatural and human psychology, and romanticism tended to regard satire as something unworthy of serious attention. So industrialism and power shifted from and aristocratic land owners to middle class city dwellers. Populations moved from and rural center to an urban center. So these are inventions in that era. So famous people of that era, Charles Darwin and Albert and Mark Twain and Alexander. Cromwell, Henry Ford, Booker, and Emma Dickinson, Edgar, Henry, Ralph Laurenson, Walt Whitman, and Karl Marx. So, Romanticism tended to regard satire as something unworthy of serious attention, a prejudice still influential, today. The romantic movement in literature was, preceded by the Enlightenment and succeeded by realism. From some authors cite 16th century poet Isabella de More as an early, precursor of romantic literature. Her lyric covering themes of isolation, of loneliness, and which reflected the tragic event of her life are considered an impressive, of romanticism differing from the his fashion of the time based on the philosophy of love. The romantic in English poetry go back to the middle of the 18th century, including figures such as George Wharton and Headmaster and his brother. So, maintain that invention and imagination were the chief qualities of a part of the Scottish poet, and the influence is early development of the Romanticism with the international success of the cycle of poems published in 1762, inspiring both Gothic and the young Walter Scott. Thomas is generally considered the first romantic poet in English. Both and the work involved, from and like as what they claimed as was earlier literature that they had discovered or compiled was in fact entirely their own work. The Gothic novel beginning with and the Castle of was an important one strain of romanticism with a delight in horror and fate and exotic. So, Satin matched in Alpe's case by his role in the early revival of Gothic architecture and a novel of Lawrence and an early German influence came from June and who's the sorrows of a young so where they had a young man throughout Europe and emulating its protagonist to a young artist with a very sensitive and passionate temperament. Film artist, we can say that a young artist with a very sensitive and passionate temperament. At that time, Germany was a multitude of small, separate streets, and Gothic works would have a seminal influence in developing a unifying sense of nationalism. Another philosophic influence came from the German idealism of Johann and at that making palace and a center for early and became a center of German Romanticism, where writers and poets such as met regularly in literary uh, circles. Important motifs in German Romanticism are traveling nature, for example, the German forest and Germanic myth, the later German romanticism of, for example, ETA and was darker in its motifs and has gothic elements. The significance to romanticism of childhood innocence, the importance of imagination and theories all combine to give an descendant importance to folk literature, non-classical mythology, and children's literature above all in Germany, and were significant literary figures who together published and a collection of and versified folk tales. The first collection of was published in 1812. So unlike the much later work of the Christian and who was publishing his invented tales in Danish from 1835. These German works were at least mainly based on collected folk tales, and they remain true to the style of the telling in their early addition through later and writing some parts. One of the brothers Jacob published in 1835, and mythology, a long academic work on Germanic and mythology. Another stream is exemplified by there's highly emotional language and the depiction of physical violence in his play. So, what does the term and what does the term of romanticism we can see here. So, in English literature, the key figures of the Romantic movement are considered to be the group of poets, including William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and John Keats, Lord Byron, and P.B. Shelley, and the much older William Blake, followed later by the isolated figure of John Clare, also such novelists as Walter Scott from Scotland and Mary Shelley, and the essayist William Hazlitt and Charles Lamb. The publication in 1798 of lyrical ballads with many of the finest poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge is often held to mark the start of the movement. The majority of the poems were by William Wordsworth, and many, felt with the lives of the poor in his native Lake District, or his feelings about nature, which he more fully developed in his long poems and prejudice and Prelude, never published in his lifetime. The longest poem in the volume was Coleridge, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which showed the Gothic side of English Romanticism and the exotic setting that many works featured, and in the period when they were writing, the lake poets were widely regarded as a group of radical, though they were supported by the critic and writer William Hazlitt and others. In contrast, Lord Byron and Walter Scott achieved enormous fame and influence throughout Europe with works exploiting the violence and drama of their exotic and historical settings. And Gothic called Byron undoubtedly the greatest genius of our century, and Scott achieved immediate success with his long narrative poem, The Lay of the Last Israel. So, the romantic, movement in music and coincides with the general romantic movement in all arts. At this period, the arts of literature and painting began to influence music in the Romantic era. Music acquired a poetic or philosophical meaning. Antiquity and folk northeastern history and exotic cultures were examined as possible sources of inspiration. Characteristics of the Romantic period music is not as and on repetition as in classical music. The music often directly tells a story, and exploration of tone, colors, much bigger and gestures popularity off chamber music. Music is, highly, emotional. Poetry and music are intimately fused. So musical innovations, we can say that invention of the songs, like invention of the symphonic poem, great works written for solo piano, and composers stretched the listener's ear by creating a great deal of tunings using chromatic notes and extensions of the triad, and composers begin to and drift away from the strong sense of tonality heard in classical music founding of conservatory. So this is, very important part of the, in literature. In contrast, Lord Byron and Walter Scott achieved enormous fame and influence throughout Europe, with works exploiting the violence and drama of their gothic and historical setting, and called Byron's undoubtedly the greatest genius of our century. Scott achieved immediate success with his long narrative poem "The Lay of the Last Stir" in 1805, followed the full epic poem, and both were set in the distant Scottish past already evoked in, like Romanticism and Scotland were to have a long and fruitful partnership. Byron had equal success with the first part of Joy and Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812, followed by, four Turkey's talent, and tales, all in the form of long poems, and starting with the in 1813 drawing from his grand tour, which had reached, man Europe, and on reaching the themes of the Gothic novel inverts these feature different variations of the Byronic hero, and his own life contributed a further version. Scott, meanwhile, was effectively inventing the historical novel beginning in 1814 with, like sat in the 7745 Jacobite Rising, which was a highly profitable success, followed by over 20 further, like, over the next 17 years, with setting going back to the, so composer, we can say that. So, in contrast to Germany, and Romanticism in English literature had little connection with the nationalism, and the Romantic were often regarded with suspicion of the, for the sympathy, and many felt for the ideals of the French Revolution, and whose collapse and, replacement with the, dictatorship, and Napoleon was an elsewhere in Europe a shock to the movement, though his novels and celebrated Scottish identity, identity and history, and Scott was politically a firm, and but had admitted to Jacobite and sympathies. Several spent, much time abroad, and a famous stay on Lake and Geneva with Byron and Shelley in 1816 produced the, hugely influential novel and by Shelley's wife to be married, and Shelley's, and the Villa, the, vampire by, Byron's doctor John William, the lyric of Robert Burns in Scotland, and Thomas More from Ireland, Ireland reflected in different ways their country and the romantic interest in folk literature, but neither had a fully romantic approach to life or their work. Though they have modern critical and champions such as like Scottish novels, are today more likely to be experienced in the form of the many operas that composers continue to base on them over the following decades, such as Lucidy and Byron is now most highly regarded for his short lyrics and his generally unromantic prose writing, and especially his letters and his unfinished satire. And unlike many romantics and Byron's widely publicized personal life and appear to match his work, and his death at 36 in 1824 from disease when helping the Greek War of Independence appeared from a distance to be a suitably romantic and drenching his legend. Keats in and Shelley in 1822 both died in Italy, and Blake in 1827 and Coleridge and largely and ceased to write in the 1820. Wordsworth was by 1820 by respectable and highly regarded, holding a movement and but wrote relatively little in the discussion of English literature. The romantic, the romantic period is often regarded as finishing around the 1820 or sometimes even earlier. Although many authors of the succeeding decades were no less committed to romantic values, the most significant novelist in English during the peak Romantic period other than Walter Scott was Jane Austen, whose essentially conservative world and view had little in common with her romantic contemporaries and retaining a strong belief in and social rules, though critics such as Claudia and have detached and so under the surface of many works such as but around the mid-century, the undoubtedly romantic novels of the most notably Wuthering Heights, both published in 1847. So in so gradually left the patrons and system and became free agent of their own works, and this means that the composer, that their music and their livelihood depend on the public approval, and for the first time a composer's work might not be publicly performed during his or her lifetime, and romantics saw themselves as outsiders, isolated from mainstream and society, and struggling to express their creative ideas. In general, composers held higher social status than in the classical period, and the rise of virtuosic performers, the public was captured by and so resulted from the just trust both in numbers and complexity became necessity to have one person to lead and control the orchestra. So what Byron, Keats and Shelley all wrote for the stage, but with little success in England, with Shelley's the Sensi and perhaps the best work produced, and thou that was not played in a public theatre in England until a century after his death. Byron's plays, along with dramatizations of his poems and Scottish novels, were much more popular on the continent and especially in France. And through these versions, several were turned into operas, many still performed today. If contemporary poets had little success on the stage, the period was a legendary one for performance of Shakespeare and went some way to restoring his original text and removing the Augustan improvement to themselves. To the greatest actor of the period, Edmund Kean restored the tragic ending to King Lear, and Coleridge said that seeing him act was like reading Shakespeare by flashes of lighting. And although after union with England in 1707, Scotland increasingly adopted English language and wider and cultural and norms and culture and norms and as well as leading the trend for pastoral poetry, helping to develop the stanza as a poetic form. And James and was the first Scottish poet to gain an international reputation, claiming to have found poetry written by the ancient and bard ocean, and he published translation that acquired international popularity, being proclaimed as a Celtic of the classical epic and written in 762 was speedily translated into many European languages, and its appreciation of natural beauty and treatment of the ancient legend has been credited more than any single work with bringing about the romantic movement in European and especially in German literature. So general musical characteristics, individuality, expressive and aims and subjects, nationalism and exotism, rise and importance of, programs, music, and musical elements. So we can see that melodrama play a very important part in English literature. Age of lyrism, unending melodies appeal to the emotions, and phrases and tended to be longer and irregular than themes were more complex and utilized, and seism were more complex and utilized advent of theme transformation. So so musical elements, your texture is also a very important part in the form of literature. Essentially homophonic, tended to be thick, heavy, and lush, and dynamics, gradual and much wider range, extreme of dynamic variation used unused extensively throughout the compositions and timber instrumentation. This period saw a full exploration of the instrumental families. Instruments were used for both their individual and collective color potential, and instrumental timbre was used to convey mood and atmosphere. Orchestra have become much larger, and 70 players to more than 100, resulting in the necessity of a conductor, and instrument could play louder and carry and instruments were capable of major changes in dynamic. So string means sections increased in size and were given more difficult accompaniment parts, scales, and woodwinds. Development of new instrument were invented by Adolf and Piccolo, and So important improvements in wind instruments, so fingering to for flutes and arranged and achieved better facility and intonation for the performer and greater musical range. So brass addition of and improvement to on brass instruments allowed the playing of a full chromatic compass for the first time and to more easily play thicker runs of notes and tubas and the were added. So these are some important famous romantic composers, and we can see that Richard Wagner and Peter, and so what they done. So uh, so Scotland was also the location of two of the most important literary the era, and which had a major impact on the development of British literature and drama in the era of Romanticism. Duncan and Alex Benchmore suggest that publications like the novels of Scott and these a part of a highly dynamic Scottish crucial figure in the transition from the classical to romantic. So, period really began around 1815. Works from this period are characterized by their intellectual depth, their formal innovations, and their intense, highly personal expression. Frederick. So modest and Peter. So, Russian composer wrote 11 operas, 4 connectors, and most remembered for his ballads Sleeping Beauty and Swan Lake. And music is intense and curly and emotional. It has been speculated that he committed suicide. So, tuba and bass and opera very popular during the romantic era. Composers and focused during the romantic era. Composers focused on melodies and themes. Use interest in songs written as part of a cycle, a complete story told with related songs, and so in this class, we have discussed. So in this class, we have learned many things related to romantic era in English literature, and where classical had been reason and order, rules. Romantic was emotion, adventure, imagination, opera, and changing from one key to another. So huge interest in songs written as part of a cycle, a complete story told with several related songs, and what was happening in the world during this period. Lot of changes, lot of changes, and happening in the world during this period. And we can say that there were a lot of changes in social and political influences. Industrialism and first occurred in Britain, and power shifted from aristocratic land owners to middle class city dwellers. Populations moved from an agrarian, rural, and center to an urban and center. So inventions, we have seen lot of inventions in that era. So famous people from the era. So we have discussed lot of famous, author in that era. Charles Darwin, the most, he had done, a very masterpiece. We can see his masterpiece in that era, and Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud and Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, Alexander Graham Bell, Henry Ford, and beating Washington, Karl Marx, and Jack the Ripper, Walt Whitman, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David, Edgar, Emily Dickinson, James. So famous artists, Paul Snan, Dodders, and Edgar, Claude, and Edward. So lot of changes, lot of scene we can see here. So, what does the term romantic mean? We have discussed this thing. The romantic movement in music, coincides with the general romantic movement in all arts. And this period, the arts of literature and painting begin to influence the music. In the romantic era, music acquired poetic or philosophical meaning. Antiquity, folklore, and history and exotic cultures were examined as possible sources of inspiration. So, characteristics of the Romantic period: music is not as reliant on repetition as in classical music. The music often directly tells a story, and exploration of tone, colors, much bigger, and orchestras, and popularity of chamber music. And music is highly emotional. Poetry and music are intimately fused, and inventions of the strong song cycle, and invention of the symphonic poem, great works written for solo piano, and composers stressed the listener's ear by creating a great deal of tones using chromatic notes and extensions of the triad. And composers began to drift away from the strong sense of tonality had in classical music. Founding of conversations, conservatories, and composer, you know gradually left the Japanese system, became freezings of their own works. And performers rise of two performers. The public was captured by Cheersley, and we can say, and conjecture and general musical characteristics and musical elements. Melody, age of lyricism, and melodies appeal to the emotions. Phrases tended to be longer and irregular in length. Themes were more complex, utilized, and advent of theme transformation. And by the end of the 19th century, and musical elements, texture essentially homophonic, tended to be thick, heavy, and lush. dynamics, gradual, much, and ranges, extremes of dynamic variation, timbre, and instrumentation. This period saw a full exploration of the instrumental families. Instruments were used for both their individual and collective color. Potential instrumental timbre were used to convey mood and atmosphere. So, orchestra strings, sections increased in size and were given more difficult and parts, woodwinds development of new instruments and were invented by Adolf and Piccolo and these important improvements in wind and instruments. So thank you so much. In next class we will study about the history of English literature. We will study.